Shalom Aleichem. I'd like to share a little bit some stories from my latest Sefer, Chabad and Gedolim. It just came out 2 weeks ago, together with another book, Chabad and Mir. So the stories about Chabad and Mir will leave for another time. The Gedolim that I review in this book is the Chazon Ish, the Chofetz Chaim, Reb Moshe Feinstein, Reb Velvel Brisker, Reb Chaim Brisker, and the Ponovitz and Chabad. You can see them all on the cover here, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is on top. So the book's about the relationship of the Rabbeim, Lubavitch, and these Gedolim. So I'm going to talk today about Ponovitz. And we in Chabad know that the Ponovitz of Bnei Brak, post passing of Rabbi Yosef Kahaneman, who was the one who started Ponovitz, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But we know, of an opposition that came forth from the Bnei Brak Ponovitz group and the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Shach, to the Rebbe and Lubavitch. And we're not going to, talk about that. If you really want to know, you'll need to read in between the lines in this book of mine, Chabad and Gedolim. In 1949, the Ponovitz Rav came to America to raise money. In general, he was a super fantastic fundraiser, and he raised money to put up yeshivas throughout Eretz Yisrael. He had been the Rav in Ponovitz from 1919, I believe, to 1939, approximately 20 years. Before him, the Rav was, I believe, Reb Itchel Ponovitcher, Reb Yitzchok Rabinovich, I think his last name was Rabinovich, and he passed away in 1919, and who took over was Rabbi Kahaneman. People are not aware, but there were two Lubavitcher shuls in Ponovitz. One was more like a shtibel, and the other one was actually a brand new building. And there's correspondence between the Frierdiker Rebbe and his chassid, Reb Yeshua Isaac Baruch, Hashem Yinkem Domov, who was a friend in Lubavitch of Reb Peretz Mochkin and Reb Shlomo Chaim Kesselman and others. And he was a mashpia in Kovna. The Rebbe appointed him as a mashpia, and then later, in 1940, the Rebbe sent him to Vilna, knowing that the Talmidei HaYeshiva from Otfotsk ran to Vilna, like many other yeshivas, based on the advice of Reb Chaim Oizer and the Frierdiker Rebbe. And he was there in Mashpia in 1940. Rabbi Shimon Goldman in his book talks about him. Rabbi Garfinkel, my Rebbe, told me about him. Rabbi Reichik told me about him. He was a very special personality, and in my next book on Telz and Chabad, in Yitz Hashem, there'll be a little bit about Rabbi Yeshua Isaac Baruch. Anyway, this Rabbi Yeshua Isaac Baruch had correspondence with different Lubavitcher Chassidim in Lita, and the Rebbe asked him to be in charge of getting reports from all of the various Lubavitchers in the little Shtetelach and the big cities, in Ponovitz and in Telz and in other cities all around, because there were Lubavitchers all around. They weren't maybe Lubavitcher cities like Babroisk and Neville. They were more considered Lubavitcher Shtet, because the majority of the populace there of Yidden were Lubavitchers. But here they were not, but there was Lubavitchers all over. And you can bet you when you have Lubavitchers, they're going to make a shtibel, they're going to make a shul, and they did. But forget if it was, I think it might have been 1925, I forget the year, but they built also a nice large shul. It happens to be that Rabbi Kahaneman lived on the block of the shul, and he said that the chassid that the Rebbe Rashab sent was Reb Shmuel Lisan. There's a Lubavitcher family Lisan of Kfar Chabad in Montreal. So there, Zayda, Elta Zayda, whatever, the Lisan family, there was the Tomim who learned to Lubavitch Reb Shmuel, and the Rebbe Rashab sent him to be a mashpia, a madrich in Ponovitz. There's details about that, why, who he married, and I wrote that as well in this book, Chabad and Gedolim. So this Rabbi Lisan was a personality and a respectful person, a Talmud Chochem in all areas of Torah, and the Ponovitz Rav became acquainted with him, and he would go into the shul, and he writes how he remembers going there a Simchas Torah and seeing how the Chassidim dance, and it was different to the way he celebrated and orchestrated Simchas Torah in his own shul. So I assume he finished earlier, and meanwhile the Hasidim are still farbrengen and dancing. So he went in to see and to participate. So in general, the yachas, the relationship between the Ponovitz Rav and Rabbi Shmuel Lisan and the Lubavitcher Chassidim was a good one, a healthy one. Later, when he came to Eretz Yisrael after the war, came during the war, but he decided to rebuild, I think, 18 yeshivas. He wanted to rebuild 18 yeshivas that were destroyed in Europe. He wanted to have a zecher, a memorial for them in Eretz Yisrael. The biggest of the 18 was, of course, the Ponovitz yeshiva that stands till today in Bnei Brak. To do this, he needed a lot of energy and a lot of money, and he went around raising funds, and he raised a lot of money for that, and he put up institutions. He was a very, very successful person. Besides a Talmud Chacham, he was a serious Talmud Chacham too, and he's called until today not the Ponovitz Rosh Yeshiva, he's called the Ponovitz Rav. And he basically led Ponovitz in Eretz Yisrael from 1943 when the yeshiva opened up till 1969 when he passed away. Some of the things that he did that others were upset about is that on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on the Israeli Day of Independence, he had the Israeli flag raised on top of the building of Ponovitz, and I included a picture of this in my book as well. Throughout the year it wasn't there, but on that day he raised it. He also invited the former president Ben Tzvi and his wife was known to be anti-religious, and that caused a big to-do, and he didn't back down. The Chazon Ish, who lived in Bnei Brak, knew about it, and he wouldn't tell him not to do it. So what he did, they say, is that he left Bnei Brak that day, so they shouldn't, have a time, and why he didn't come to the event. So in 1949, he comes to the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe benches him and talks with him as much as possible. As you know, the Frierdiker Rebbe's his speech wasn't clear, but he had yechidus with the Rebbe. And a few days later, or maybe the next day, the Rebbe wrote him a letter. It's printed in Igros Kodesh of the Frierdiker Rebbe, thanking him for coming. Now you have to understand what that means. This is the 1940s, when we know that the establishment of the Rosh Yeshivas and the Litvische Rabbanim were opposed to different things the Frierdiker Rebbe did, Le'alta L'Geula, Le'alta L'Tshuva, and there was the whole sichsuch, the whole disagreement about the money from the Vada Hatzolah. I've also written about this at length in Lakewood and Lubavitch. So, it would be helpful if you're interested in this type of history. You should be reading these books. I'm not here to push the books, I'm just telling you factually that I've included that there, and it would be a good idea for you to read it from A to Z, because, the hearsay we hear is not good. It's not necessarily true. It's not exactly the same way it happened. So here you have documents and you have support. And anyway, B'kitzur, they were opposed to the Frierdiker Rebbe. For Rabbi Kahaneman to come to the Frierdiker Rebbe in 1949 was like a slap in their face. That means that he acknowledges the Frierdiker Rebbe is an Adam Gadol, a tzaddik, a leader, someone who he wants to meet and talk to and give covet to. And therefore, the Rebbe knew that. The Frierdiker Rebbe was on top of things, and he understood that. So the next day or a few days later, he sends them a letter thanking him for coming. And I believe, this is my assumption, that what was behind that thank you was, thank you for showing that you stand up for the emes, for the truth. And this is the way I see this Rabbi Kahaneman, from the various research I did about him, that he was a man of truth, and if he believed that this is right, and I'm not saying he was always right, but if he believed it was right, and if it was man hatayrav, etc., he did it, and he wasn't spoiled, wasn't impacted about what this gadol will say, this rab will say, etc., etc. And Lepoil, we see that he got his way, and no one cut his funding, and he was very, very mutzliach. So when we talk about Ponovitz, we have to know that he and what he did is the real Ponovitz, and the real Ponovitz had a good shaykhis with Lubavitch in Europe, in Lita, and even in America even in Eretz Yisrael from 1943 till 69, and that's when he passed away, and then Rav Shach took over, and when he took over, things started to go downhill, and especially at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, which maybe we'll discuss at some other time, or we won't discuss because it's better not to discuss it. The ikir is that it's a Chassidish B'lava Malke, and it's time to hold ourselves strong, to go further with Koyach, to know and believe that Mashiach is coming ASAP, and to do Torah mitzvahs and bring people in, and especially now that we've finished with this Corona and the Magefa is finished, we have to follow what Chazal tell us, that V'hamagefa netzara, the Magefa stopped and ceased to be. So the opportunity for that is now to double and triple your efforts in Torah mitzvahs and afotzas habayonos chutzam, learning Chassidus, learning more Gemara, Yekib Shuta, Gemara, Rashi Teisus, Memfarshim, and to the Shulchan Aruch. The Rebbe was always pushing we should learn the Piskei Dinim, and we should b'zeicha taka the Geula Shleima B'karev Mamish.